work session.
Mr. President, I would like to amend the agenda to add Dr. Maher to address regarding the elementary schedule.
Okay. Do I have a second on that?
Second.
All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. That motion carries. Dr. Maher.
All right. Well, let me say that in the last 24 for sure, maybe 48 hours, there has been a whole lot of passion exhibited on the conversation that centers around the elementary schedule in general, but really our commitment to the fine arts specifically. And I want to share a little bit about where we are in that process. I also want to share that as a school district, and while I don't speak for the board, I bet I do on this topic, we share that passion. And I know personally I do as well. Spent thousands of dollars and a lot of time with lessons for my own kids and purchase of instruments, et cetera, et cetera. Beyond that, I currently sit as a board member in the South Dakota Symphony Orchestra. And I think if I did anything to hinder the passion for the arts in general and music specifically in our community, I would be excommunicated from that board. So that's just a little personal aside. Let me share why we are looking at the elementary schedule from a big picture perspective, and let me schedule where we are in that process. Let me talk about where we are in that process. The why stems back to our strategic plan. And one of the things that we talked about from a communication perspective in the strategic plan was we do a lot of output when it comes to information. And our question to ourselves was, how do we get more information in? And one of the things that we implemented was focus groups. Some of those focus groups have been with teachers over the last 3 years. And one of the issues that bubbles up with each elementary focus group that we have is our schedule is chaotic and very tough to deal with. So I challenged the Curriculum Services Department to look at this year, we've had a conversation for a couple of years, to look at the elementary schedule and see if we could build a better mousetrap. It isn't about budget cuts. It isn't about fitting into this small square when it comes to the budget. It's also not about cutting any particular area. And what it is about is balancing everything that we have to put into that schedule, from a core curriculum perspective to a fine arts perspective and to everything else perspective. What makes sense in terms of balance in that elementary school schedule? So where are we in that process of development? We're smack dab in the middle of it. I know the group led by Dr. Boyson and the Curriculum Services side of our house has worked long and hard this year to try to figure out what might be, not what is, but what might be. And just last week, they began to take that information out and took a draft of what might be out to the first of 3 conversations that we're having with our teachers. We received feedback at that meeting, much like you have seen through the emails you've received and that I have seen through the emails I've received. And that will inform our actions as we move forward. So we're not at an end point yet. So I'd asked for the gift of time before we jump to any conclusions of how this looks. 2 more, as I mentioned, only one of those information gathering sessions has taken place so far. 2 more of those sessions are yet to take place. Again, I'll reiterate, this is not something that we're looking at due to budget cuts. This has nothing to do with the budget. In fact, what we're looking at is budget neutral. This is about putting together a schedule that makes sense for student outcomes, makes sense for our workforce, the teachers who deliver the curriculum on a daily basis, and of course, something that makes sense for our whole community as well. In the area specifically of music, and I know this isn't only about music in terms of what we've received information on, but the majority of feedback I've received is in that particular area. I would tell you that right now we are ahead and way ahead of the minutes offered of at least everybody who is contiguous to us, and I don't know about how far out this extends, in terms of minutes offered for music instruction on a weekly basis. And I don't say that as a reason to cut those minutes, but I say that as something that we're proud of and something that we want to see continue. So we will work with that in mind. And for those of you who have reached out to us by email or are thinking to reach out to us by email, I want you to know that, at least from the central office perspective, I know Dr. Nold, Dr. Boyson, and myself have received, many emails. It is our goal to respond to each of you, hopefully today, but there's been a lot of you. So we'll do the best that we can to reach back out. And again, I'm not asking you to buy anything. I'm not selling anything, but I am asking you for the gift of time while we figure out what that schedule is going to look like. So those are my concluding remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Maher. We do have, since that did become a budget item with the change, we will take public input, and Amy Scott Stoltz has signed up. You've got 5 minutes. If you will step to the microphone up at the...
Up here?
Yeah, yep. Thank you. And give us your name and address, please.
Thank you. All right, my name is Amy Scott Stoltz. I'm a parent of a student here in the district, and I was contacted by a teacher who attended one of these meetings, and then followed by the landslide of other teachers, other parents who are very concerned about the idea of cutting the specials. Not only the music, but also the art and the PE. So it's a rounded approach. The teachers themselves have fabulous ideas on how to increase reading scores in the music classes, in the art classes. I want you to take the time, I urge you to take the time to listen to those teachers. They have a wealth of knowledge that has not been tapped into, I don't think, here. And they feel as this is a done deal. That is what they feel. So please communicate with them on what is actually going on if it's not a done deal yet. They want the specials in there. They know the importance of it. If they haven't yet, they're going to inundate you with research on that. So they feel very passionately about this. As a parent of a student, I can't imagine cutting that time. Especially at the elementary level, especially in winters like we have, where they don't get outside for recess. I can't imagine the specials time being cut as well. That would academically harm many children. And I hope you take the time to really focus on what's best for the kids. I know you say it's budget neutral. I know that there's other issues involved that we are not aware of. This has been pretty quickly thrown at us all. And please take the time, do what you've done in the past, which has been fantastic communication with the public, and really listen to what parents have to say, what teachers have to say on this subject, because you'll find the passion is there for our specials. Music, PE, art, all of them are very important, and I hope you continue your tradition of listening to the public and listening to the teachers. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. We will move on now to the budget. We do have another person signed up, but that will be, yep, on the budget, so we'll, yeah.
Thank you. Everybody's got a budget book, and I'm just going to be going through these pages, and I think Deanne's going to be trying to show what we're looking at up on the screen, so if somebody doesn't have the book, they can follow along. I'd like to direct your attention, I guess, to, and then the middle of every page there's a green page number. Sometimes there's other page numbers because these are different spreadsheets pulled together. So the green page number is the one I'm referring to. So if we just look at page 1, as much as I like to think that everybody looks at our 5-year plan and it makes all perfect sense to them, I found out recently that isn't the case. And so what we tried to do is get a real simplistic view in 1 year of what's going on in that 5-year plan. And you all know this because you hear, we talk about it every year that we have an efficiency factor, and we expect to find efficiency. That's the way our 5-year plan balances. And so some people think, why are we talking about budget cuts when, you know, we didn't go back in state aid? We had a net 1.8% increase is what I'd call it. But because of the 0.7, which was one time last year. So this is a real simplistic look at 1 year, this year, that we're budgeting for right now, of what's going on. So our revenue is about $163.5 million. We have a $9.1 million opt-out. We're actually proposing a transfer of capital outlay of $3 million, which is 2.75 less than last year, I think. So the total is $175.6 million. Our expense target was 176.3. That would eat into our fund balance by $700,000, and that would take our fund balance down to about $11 million. The expenses as submitted and recommended by our committees was 177.8, so it was 1.5 over that target. And that's why we talked about when we changed the budget guidelines and timelines this year, we added some things that the exec team would look at possible some bigger cuts that might not come out of the committees, because we were a little leery of anybody coming up with 1.5, and we knew we needed to meet that number. That was built into the budget last year. So, and we'll go through what many of those reductions are, but that was one thing we kind of anticipated, I guess, back in November. So that's the what, and that's kind of where I usually stop talking, but I've been told, since I'm surrounded by educators, that isn't always good enough. So the why on that is, this is just very simplistic, but it kind of spelled, our state aid increase, our net, because it was 2.5, but we got 0.7 one-time money on a per student basis last year, so it was built in. So our net increase was 1.8%. Our salary increase that we're proposing is 2.75. And if you look at the difference between 1.8 and 2.75 on our general fund salaries, that's $917,000. Our benefit increases, Social Security and retirement, they go up with the salary, so that's 2.75. Our health and dental are at about 4.6. Dental's a little less than that, but health drives most of that. The shortfall there is $518,000. It comes to almost 1.5 million, 1,435,000. That's simplistic. There's a lot more things going on in there, but that's a real basic look at why you have to, if we're going to try to keep our salaries moving forward, and we're not going to get state aid increases commensurate with kind of the minimum of what we want to do, we're going to have to find efficiencies within the budget. So that's the general fund version. Next page, on page, oh yeah.
The opt-out, you mentioned we have 9.1 million that we have opted out for now. What would be the maximum that we could opt out?
We're currently authorized for 12.5 million for now, and then I'll show you in the plan where the 7.5 million is going to come off. Calendar year 2022.
One of the things I'd like to suggest, I guess, is in the past we have pulled together the Finance Action Network to look at where we're at, budget overall, opt-out, and wondering if this might not be the year to bring them together. Thank you. To bring that Finance Action Network together again. Budget's tighter. We're having to look at more things that we're gonna struggle to keep up with, and maybe now is the right time to get that outside set of eyes back to look at what we are recommending to see if they think we're on track. So,
Yeah, I'm good with that.
no opposition to
No.
doing that, so,
None from the central office either. I think it's a great idea. I think timing's perfect for that.
okay, great, thank you.
Thanks. The next page is just kind of the same thing, but for special education. They too, we had to look at some efficiencies in there. Revenue at 45.4. Their expense target was 46 for a fund balance change of 600,000. Their fund balance is at $1 million. That's fairly low for them. It's a little over, it's about 3%. Expenses as submitted were 47.8, so we're looking at 1.8 million roughly over the next year or two getting out of there. Their state aid, again, their state aid increase was the same, 1.8, and they didn't get the one-time money. So they had a I did it the same, but they actually it should have been 1 point. State aid increase for FY20 was actually 1% for them, and they didn't get the 1.7. So the salary increase then is 2.75. The shortfall is 260,000. Benefits increases again, and so their benefit shortfall and salary and benefit shortfall in 1 year is 422,840, and it was even more than that because they didn't get the 1.8. All right, they didn't get the one. They got the one. They did not get the extra 0.7, so they were already behind. So, but I just was using the same math, and that's noted down below. And then one other thing that last year, you remember, after the budget, we increased the EA salaries because we were having a very hard time hiring, starting EAs because you know, the other salaries are at McDonald's and other places that were approaching ours or maybe even exceeding ours. So if you look at the budget from 2 years ago and come up to this year, the salaries now have increased by $1 million, and that there was no state aid or to do that. So that's another heavy factor in this, of course.
Todd, going back to page 1, it might be helpful just to talk again high level opt-out versus our bond.
Oh, yeah. So we'll in a little bit, we'll see what's happened to our property taxes and what is going to happen next year. But last year we passed a bond to build facilities, and the facilities were the biggest three, or the three: high school, middle school, and elementary school. That isn't for the teachers inside. That isn't for the principals. It wasn't for the custodians or the heat and the fuel. That was to build the buildings. And the reason we did that is what happened to the capital outlay restrictions a few years ago, where we weren't able to access the $3 anymore. That's why we made the $3 promise. And at the time we did that, our capital outlay levy was $287. We said we're going to go back up to $3 between the two, and no more than that. And that's where that 13 cents came from. As far as the opt-out goes, that is to fund the things I just said the bond was not to fund: teacher salaries, heat and lights, and all the operating costs of a school district. And that we're at now $9.1 million in our opt-out. We've had an opt-out since calendar year 2003. It was passed in 2002. We've had a version of that opt-out, and we have a little history going back to 2012 in here as well. We'll look at that. The one doesn't have much to do with the other than when you build a building, you have more heat and lights. But as far as like the teachers and the biggest expenses we have, whether they're jammed into a building with 2,500 kids, as long as we're staffing at 25 to 1, we're going to hire as many teachers no matter where they're at.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump ahead to the executive summary, which kind of spells out the major changes. That's on page 10. Overall, our revenue is going to be increased by $3.7 million. Our budget is going to be $175.4 million in revenue. Our expense budget is going to be $176.2, or that's what we're proposing. That's a $3.5 million change. it's gonna be about, it's actually rounded up, but $0.8 million of spending into the fund balance. As we talked about, we're really driven by the state aid. We talk about this often, and I think we did it at the last regular board meeting. We were talking about the legislature. Almost 90% of our general fund dollars, revenue, comes from the state aid formula, whether that's property taxes or state aid. Combination of that is almost 90%. And about 85% of our expenditures are salaries and benefits. So that the revenue side has to drive the expenditure side. Eventually, you can't beat the physics on it. You can't beat the economics on it for a long time. So that is what drives our plan. We are going to spend into the fund balance by $764,000. It's lower than projected, but that's because we've got a $3 million transfer from the capital outlay fund budgeted for next year that we didn't anticipate last year. And it's because of the timing on our bond payments. We didn't have to, the first payment was particularly low, so we're ramping up to what we're gonna, so the bond didn't cost as much as it would have if you bought a house and you had a payment in the next month. We're ramping up to that. So that's what's going on there. The lowest projected fund balance over the 5-year period is 5%, with a 7% projected fund balance in FY24. Last year, we had planned the lowest projected fund balance to be 5.5. When we get in this plan, I'll tell you a number to look at. It's going to be about, the number is going to be about $10 million is where our fund balance needs to be to cash flow the district. It's about $10 million. $10 million equates to close to $25 million in actual cash at the end of June. And then we spend down about $20 million going from end of June to the end of October when we get our first big tax payment. So 10 million gives you a fairly safe cushion, but not much of one for cash flow, not for major cuts or anything like that. So we'll talk about that too as we go. So just the revenue highlights, $600,000 is new state aid formula funds due to increased enrollment and increased ELL enrollment. $3.4 million in additional state aid formula funds due to a 2.5% increase in the ongoing per student allocation. And in the formula itself, that is 2.5, so that's the state aid part of that. $1 million in increased state aid due to the reallocation of other fund revenues. Last year, because of the hold harmless, we lost about $1 million in the formula. We're just getting that back, and in the next 2 years, we project to go positive on that. $200,000 in school and public land funds, additional. $600,000 in additional interest. Interest rates are up a little bit. It doesn't help our bond payments, but it helps revenue where you have money. And transfer $3 million from the capital outlay fund. Talked about that. Expenditures, what's changing there? $2.7 million increase in salaries, $260,000 in K-12 teacher salaries for additional students, $1.2 million increase in health insurance and other benefit increases, $670,000 transfer of expenses from the SPED fund to the general fund. We'll go through that in a little more detail. $230,000 in miscellaneous increases, and several general fund reductions. Stay with it. And that's trying to get that efficiency factor, which is what we went through in the big budget committee. And so some of those on a high level, $250,000 in reduced contract costs. I think you're going to get a report on that. I think it's next Monday. But we believe we'll be able to save $250,000 on a particularly large contract we have. $185,000 in FTE. It has to do with extra FTE in the high school budget that is not associated with the 25-to-1. It's over and above that, and just getting rid of some hold harmlesses and things like that. So that's $185,000. $30,000 stipend for tech integration specialists. Many years ago, was it a $500 stipend? We added in a teacher to take the leadership on tech ed. We think we've come a long way since then, and we don't need to have a leader that we compensate for. $39,000 for taking the AP coordinator planning periods from 2 to 1 a day, so they have one planning period for AP. $109,000 $8,000 out of the middle school for tech ed EAs. Now that is there's a curriculum change there, and the old curriculum was very heavy into power tools, and it's much less reliant on them now, and that was a safety issue for that prior curriculum, and they don't feel that they're not using them nearly as much anymore. So you don't need an extra set of hands in there with the kids. $840,000 for the RISE General Ed double count. Everybody knows about our RISE program. Those are our most severely affected special ed students. Not every school has RISE classrooms in it. So SBA does, Laura Wilder doesn't, for instance. And when we would assign general fund, this isn't about special ed at all, but when we would assign general fund teachers to schools with RISE students in it, we'd count them in there. So and those kids aren't in the general ed classroom, or if they are, that's very, very little, and if they are, they have an EA, an aide with them. So our thoughts were this was a kind of a nice to have, but when you're looking at efficiency cuts, we're really, by counting those RISE students, we're artificially lowering the class size in those schools than in schools that don't have them. So we said we don't count a student, we assign to, I'm gonna say children's care, but they're Lifescape. We don't assign that student to a school and then put a teacher in there for every 25 of those. And RISE kids have special ed teachers in the RISE classrooms, so we're proposing not funding the general fund classroom for those students as well. Does that make sense? If there's 25 RISE students at SBA, they'll have one less classroom teacher, because they have actually 2 or 2.5 classroom teachers in the RISE classroom. So that's what's going on there.
So it's more of a recalculation than a
yeah, it was something that was
change in staffing per se.
Yeah. Well, it'll impact staffing, because there would be less staffing, but the reason they get the increased staffing right now is because of a double count.
Okay.
What we're saying is we're going to count all students in those buildings like we count students in other buildings.
Okay.
It's one of those things, if you said, why we do it that way? I'd say it's because we've done it that way ever since I've been here. We've always done it that way, and it's just one thing that you got to look at when you're trying to make cuts that don't hurt as much as other cuts would, that's something that maybe we should correct.
Sure. Okay.
I want to be clear, it's not a reduction in services to RISE students at all. There's no reduction in services to RISE students.
Yeah, it's just getting rid of the artificially lowered class sizes on the general fund side. Special ed, some of the big ones there. There's $1 million in early intervening services or comprehensive early intervening services. Now, what that is, on a big picture, what that is about, and it goes back several years to IDEA, allowed up to 15% of the IDEA funds to be used for kids that weren't on an IEP. They weren't special ed students yet. They weren't identified for special ed. But the idea was if we got some services to intervene, maybe they wouldn't become special ed. That they wouldn't get an IEP. Was the idea of that. And so now when you're looking at making cuts in the special education budget, you've got to serve the kids on an IEP. I mean, that's the law. You've got to do that. You don't have to serve kids in a hopes of that they won't get an IEP. Now, does it save money? Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. But you've got to serve those kids on the IEP side. So what we first looked at cutting in special ed is the early intervening services. And in addition to federal, state and local allow it now too. The state allows it with state and local funds. So that's a pretty good sum of money that's in there. And so what those cuts really involve, at the elementary level, there is a reading program, and we plan to cut that. I believe it was Read 180 they tried to implement in there, which was very successful in middle school, not so much in elementary. It might have changed since, but the idea here is to replace it with SIPs. We're gonna pump, SIPs is a new program. It's been fairly successful. We want to expand it, and we're going to use Title I dollars, federal dollars to put those in. So essentially, there is gonna be a reading intervention. It's just gonna be federal title dollars instead of CEIS money.
Not even essentially. There is going to be.
Oh, yeah.
There is reading program.
Literally, how's that?
Yes, yes,
All right.
yes.
And that's, we've been piloting that.
Yeah.
In a couple schools.
Yes.
already
Right,
in
yep.
Spain.
Seeing real,
And we're gonna
really good
expand it
results. Yeah.
for next year with federal dollars, not special ed dollars. Middle school, they have a reading intervention, Read 180. It's a 90-minute period. We're gonna take it back to the regular class size of 50. And to be honest, principals, not all, but principals in the past have asked about getting that down to 50 minutes so it matches up to their regular schedule and that those kids don't miss social studies or PE or so it's kind of nice that it'll fit in with this, that we can still offer the program and still serve the same number of kids. Now the question is, will they get executed from the program as fast? We don't know. We'll have to find out what the effect of that is. But that's the half cut at the middle school level. And at the high school, and I should have asked because I didn't remember. At the high school, we're cutting the FTE for the program. What's it called, Dan? ILET is the program they use. We'll still have that, but we're cutting the FTE, so they're gonna have to take it out of their regular 25-to-1 high school FTE allocation instead of having special allocation for these kids in this reading intervention. So that's what's going on at the high school level. The other, I guess, major thing to look at in special ed, maybe two. One is a behavior team. There's 5 behavior teams, or is it 4? 4 or 5 behavior teams that serve the elementary schools. One of those was funded with CEIS dollars, and so they were a general fund team. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to serve any kids that weren't on an IEP. So that is getting moved out and getting moved into the general fund. We feel we need that behavior team, so that's moving over there. The other one is that Tier 2 goes into ELL or elementary, middle school, high school FTE count. What that really is, it's kind of complex, but a few years ago, we really started to expand our Tier 2 classrooms, which are behavior classrooms, and half of it is for special ed students, half for general fund. Well, when we did that, we did not count that against the resource allocation into the school. And turns out some of these Tier 2 teachers do have a caseload that they manage the IEP, and it's roughly, a full-time teacher manages roughly 20 IEPs. So some of them have been managing them, others haven't. The idea here is we're gonna put them into the formula now. So it won't reduce the Tier 2 teacher program, but it'll reduce the other resource teachers, and they will every one of them will be expected to manage 10 IEPs if they're half-time special ed. So it's kind of like the RISE cut was really affected the general fund. This Tier 2 cut does not affect Tier 2 programming. It affects it's kind of a double count in I say moderate, I just said it a minute ago, the resource allocation. That's what's actually getting reduced there. So those are the major reductions. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to try to, any questions on that? And I'll just steer you to page 13. That's our 5-year plan. And Kent, your question about the opt-out,
Yep.
That's why on line 6 up top there, that's why those 3 areas, so we have 3 years of the 5-year plan that are boxed there, and it's because that assumes we maintain the ability to opt out that we have right now. But that opt-out, that $7.5 million opt-out does expire in 2020, calendar year 2022.
Okay.
So that's why that's boxed there. And you can see the plan, what it ends up with out in the future. We're at 7%, and it's not ideal, but it is enough to cash flow. You can see we drop under 10 million once there. Still think we can probably cash flow if the exact same case is in the future as it is today, but it's really getting low. You don't want to be below 10 million, honestly, very much. The key variables we look at down below the line, I guess it looks green, it's yellow on my computer, but we know we're gonna gain some money in the equalized other, we have $5.9 million of equalized other revenue there. We know when it gets fully equalized, we believe our share of it will be about $2 million more, and that's just building that in. State apportionment, of course, we adjust that every year based on what we receive. The opt-out, it assumes the same opt-out next year as this year, and then a slight growth in 2022, 2023, 2024, just a real slight one, kind of to keep up with inflation, and Doug came up with a cool spreadsheet I'll show you in a second that talks about that. Our efficiency factor, it was tough getting those efficiencies this year. Next year we call for a fairly big one too, 1%. If we don't do that, we have to, the only other way to balance the budget is salaries. So it's something in there that we have to keep in mind. Our teacher delta, that's in line with projections. Todd Tolke had brought up is our state aid increase, because I always had it at 3. I lowered it to 2.5 to be more realistic in there. And our salaries are tied to state aid, but we try to beat them by 0.75% so that the delta doesn't eat up the entire increase, so we keep our salaries going forward. That makes sense. So that's what's going on this page. The next page is just a different view of the same sheet, and it kind of shows you where our budget would be without, if you look at the very bottom, when Doug was on the board, yeah, let's put this in. If we didn't have to get those efficiency factors, look what our fund balance would do. It's extremely low. So like I said, these numbers make a lot of sense to me, and those of us that look at these pretty closely, I know to the general public, it's like, well, that's why we came out with that real simple sheet that shows what's going on in 1 year. But all this stuff affects each year going out. So if you go to page 15, that's that opt-out summary. Going back to 2012, our $7.5 million opt-out. It'll go off in 2021. We opted out in 2018 for $5 million, and that was for 2 things, really. It was for fear of federal funds reducing, and they are down a bit since then, but also fear of, we put in these new teacher salary increases, and if we get 1.5%, 2% or less from the state, what's gonna happen to them? So that was in there as so we could keep our salaries moving forward. We accessed it right away that first year, but we really haven't, we increased it at like $60,000 since that first year. So that is a tool that is out there for the board, and then that gets to your point, and we'll look at that with our Finance Action Network, the business community. He had a line over there that what would be going on if it had inflated from that $7.5 million, and you can see that amount there. And then our total budget, you can see the percent of the opt-out as a percent of the total budget. In 2012, it was 5.7. Next year, it's projected to be 5. So it's actually, you're eating away at it by not increasing it as inflation goes up for everything else. That's kind of the message showing over there. That makes sense. And then, of course, yeah, the excess shortfall, what we're not using, and then if the 7.5 goes away, then we'll be in the negative on that number, not on the positive. Our levies, this gets back to kind of Kate's question. We said we were going to increase our levy in 2019 by 13 cents. We actually didn't. We actually held it flat. But the 13-cent increase will come next year, and that's exactly what we said when we opted out. We just were able to delay it for a year. And that's found, in the payable 2020 taxes on a house whose owner shall remain nameless in southwest Sioux Falls. Since the year 2000, the total school taxes increased 31.5% in 20 years. That's average annual increase of 1.5. And you all know, and we've talked about this one on our bond issue, that of all of our neighbors, we are the lowest. We were the lowest, we still are. And if you added 13 cents to ours this year, it'd still be the lowest of all of our neighbors. Time is flying. So, any questions on any? That's a lot of info, and you know, you've got the detail of that follows this of kind of a roll-up detail, and then by cost center, the main change that's happened in the cost center, starting on page 23. We encourage you to look through that. I do want to talk about the capital outlay fund. If there isn't any questions on the general fund, and sped to kind of get in all in one big deal. Capital outlay, go to page 35, please. So remember, in the capital outlay fund, we're balancing the levy now with the bond fund. And so that's why if you look up top, our tax revenue actually drops, even though we show valuation increases of, we're cautiously projecting them at 3.5% after this year, per year. That would, on average, I mean, we average more than that usually in the district. It's more like 4.5. And that's dropping because we're lowering the levy, because the bond levy is going up, is what's happening there. Just wanted to point that out to you. We've got the technology plan fully funded. That's a good thing. And we are still able to, remember, Jeff, I didn't look this up. When's our last drawdown of the bond? Is it 2024? Yeah. So we'll be out of bond funds then, and presumably there'll be some more construction projects needed in the school district. So we are saving a little bit of money in a CIP projects fund. If you go to the next page, it shows the cash flow on that fund. We don't plan to spend any money out of it while we spend down the bond proceeds. But in 2024, if we spend nothing, we'd have $11 million for capital projects. And an elementary school will cost more than that. But then we do have money in the I'm just trying to give you. We have money in the bond fund for the elementary school. But I'm just trying to give you some perspective on that. Comparative. So that's you know, that's real high level. Any questions on that?
Questions on the budget for Todd Veek? Okay, we've got a person who is wishing to address the board on the budget. Tony Martinet, if you would give us your name and your address, please, and you've got 5 minutes.
Tony Martinet, 46220 West Shore Place. I am also president for the Sioux Falls Education Association. As a teacher, I never taught the same lesson twice. There were always changes that could be made to improve my lessons and the experience for my students, and sometimes those changes were drastic. Within a single day, I might completely revamp my entire lesson from period 1 to period 3 because it was needed to improve the educational quality of my teaching. I and most teachers understand and believe that change is needed and is good for education. As the association president, I ask them, when I have educators contact me with their concerns or reactions to any proposed change, I ask them to reflect and identify the source of their reactions. Are you reacting because there is simply something different and unknown? Or are you reacting because there's a legitimate concern about the quality of education caused by this change? If it is the former, then I encourage them to take a breath, walk away, and come back to talk when they can be open to the new possibilities that change can bring. If their reaction is founded on the latter concern about the quality of education, then we take the time to analyze and pinpoint what about the change is causing the concern for quality. I come to you today to seek more information to help me and other educators be able to identify if our reactions really are because there is simply a change with this budget, or if there's a possible impact to the overall quality of education. Being able to identify any impact to the quality of education is not always easy because some of the changes will not be known until actual implementation, or at least until the details are developed. We don't have that, and we possibly can't until the budget is actually approved. Unfortunately, most of the major changes to the budget were shared with teachers, about 2 weeks ago, and the budget goes for approval in 5 days. There has only been limited time to dig into what changes exist in this budget, so the time to ask questions is now to ensure that answers can be found. Currently, there's just 2 specific areas of concern. The first is Tier 2 behavior reclassification. With the new budget, the dedicated Tier 2 behavior teachers in our title buildings are now being included as part of the building SPED FTE. This requires that all Tier 2 teachers now pick up some of the SPED caseload paperwork at the least, and in some buildings, the Tier 2 teachers may be needed to start being more involved in providing special ed services to students. This can decrease the availability of the Tier 2 teachers to offer immediate support and interventions for behaviors in our buildings. It also means that we may have to replace some of our Tier 2 teachers because they need to have their SPED endorsement to help. Will this put extra stress on the staff in those buildings? Can this possibly lead to increased behavior escalations, which would interfere with the learning environment of our students? Is there another way a school has planned to absorb this cut and still offer effective services? Our other area of concern is time to plan adjustments. With many of the changes being proposed in the budget, adding new programs, changing personnel, reducing instructor support for some programs, or modifications to curriculum, there's a lot that needs to be figured out. There's just under 2 months left of the school year to accomplish the planning with teachers for these changes, or else the district will have to pay teachers for the time in the summer to get the work done, or there'll be a lot of rushing at the beginning of next year. What is the coordinated plan for addressing these needs? As they say, the devil is in the details, and it may be that these questions have answers, and we just need to time to share them and to find them, and the educators are willing and ready to do that work. We just like to be able to help.
Thank you. Yeah.
When did we start this process?
November,
How many committees?
19, I think.
Do we have teachers on those committees?
All virtually everyone.
Okay. And the approval on Monday night is approval of the tentative budget. The final budget is not approved until July.
Second Monday in July.
Right, so, I mean, what we're looking at is recommendation and approval of tentative budget. So, you know, of course, that means to me that there will certainly be appropriate amount of time to look at the approval. It also gives the Finance Action Network time to do their work and come back for conversation that can then be approved, final approval at the second meeting in July. So, any other questions, discussion on the budget presentation? And as always, I believe Business Manager Veek is available to answer questions between now and the meeting on Monday, and anytime we might have questions that we didn't ask today. So, we will move on then to the legislative report.
I was just going to say that nothing's changed from when I presented, to you, the board meeting at the last meeting. There was no, they had one more day of meetings, and nothing changed. It's the same. The bills passed, so I don't really have a lot to add there. I know Katie's got it.
Okay.
Dr. Maher asked me to kind of run through the bills that had passed to kind of give you a general idea of what we might be looking at for potential changes prior to our next school year. And I wanted to point out 3 different changes to you just to kind of give you a heads up. The first 2 are specifically related to board meetings that will require a change in our policy. One will be that we need to add the addition of an executive session topic of the safety issues for schools. So that will be, we will need to add that to policy BE on school board meetings, is where we have those executive sessions listed. And that was based on the House Bill 1048. The other House, the Senate Bill 91, an act to revise certain provisions regarding open meeting requirements, will also cause us to need to review both policy BE on school board meetings and policy BEDH on public participation at school board meetings. As I look at the changes to the state law, we're going to need to clarify when we need to post an agenda versus when we need to post a notice of quorum. So it used to be that we might have to post a that an official meeting might include when you all might be present at another public entity's meeting. So on some, or other non-regular meetings, so on some of those things now, we'll just have to post a notice of quorum. And looking at the impact of what the law is going to require on public input at regular meetings, what that change in regular meetings is, and whether or not we want to change our public participation in our policy based on those state law changes. So that was Senate Bill 91. And again, policy BEDH and BE. The final one that I wanted to bring to your attention, and just so you know, through the spring and summer we do a bigger review, so there might be other changes in policy needed, but just wanted to bring these to your attention. On Senate Bill 55, an act to require the national motto of the United States to be displayed in public schools. We will need to, beginning in the 1920 school year, have the national motto, "In God We Trust," displayed in each of our public schools. It has to be located in a prominent location, and it has to be on a mounted plaque, artwork, or other appropriate form, and has to be 12 inches. The display has to be 12 inches wide by 12 inches high. So as an executive leadership team, we're looking at how can we best do this in the Sioux Falls School District, and to make sure that that has a civic, patriotic purpose, as hopefully that was the intent of the legislature. And in doing so, one question I had for the board would be whether or not you would like to include that requirement. I mean, we have to follow the state law, but we could also include the requirement in our patriotic activities policy, or we could just instead issue guidance to principals on this new requirement.
From an administrative standpoint, we've had a lot of dialogue on this, and it's our intent to meet in fact and indeed the law. So we not only will meet the letter of the law, we'll meet the intent of the law as well. We want to do it in a way that's educational. We want to do it in a way that's responsive to what the legislature has required of us, and we'll bring you an example for your consideration down the road. But as legal counsel has said, the question before you today is, do we make a policy in regards to this, or do we just provide guidance to our building level leaders on how to implement this? I'm good either way.
Are you asking for us to think about this?
Yes.
Thank you. That'll be great. We will do that and then take action.
Can I have one quick question? So,
That's a nice
and I'm
font
assuming there's
size.
nothing like this, is there any other law that we are currently under that, do we have guidance or do we have policy on in our schools?
Yeah, I mean, the chapter 13 is very, so we've kind of summarized which ones we need to give more guidance on than what's stated in the law, or that we need to reiterate. For example, when I'm thinking about our patriotic activities policy, we have information on the Pledge of Allegiance. That was its original intent. Last year, when the legislature added the requirement that Boy Scouts or other patriotic groups have the right to come to school, we added that to that patriotic activities policy. So I thought that if we add it to policy, that would be where we want to go.
But the Pledge of Allegiance isn't a state law.
No.
So maybe this is a dumb question, but what beyond hanging said plaque on the wall are we required or are we intending to do? Because if that's the end of it, then I'm wondering why we would need to put it in a policy when it's kind of a,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term, one and done. We hung it up.
We wanted to, you've heard this from me before, I wanted to be the hired help on that and let you decide.
Sure.
Is this policy or
Okay.
not? I'm neutral, and I don't even have any guidance for you as to which way
Okay.
that should go. But in terms, maybe just as a foreshadowing, I would tell you that our goal isn't to just meet the intent and put up "In God We Trust." Our goal is to make this a civics lesson as well for anybody who wants to see it. So we want to meet the letter of the law and the intent of the law, and then we want to even go beyond what the law requires of us to do. And as I said, we'll bring that to you
Okay.
down the road.
We'll make it meaningful.
Yeah.
One reason to put it in policy would be if the board wanted to add specific requirements, either in addition to, or kind of to help explain how the Sioux Falls School District is going to apply this law. So for example, if you really liked the mounted plaque idea, that's not required by the law, so you'd want to require that by policy.
Okay. Any other questions on the legislature's treatment of the public schools? All right. We will move on. We are a little short on time, so for committee reports, I'll open it up. If somebody has something pressing that they want to report to the board on, we will certainly take that now. Otherwise, we'll,
Just a couple of dates that are coming up.
Yep.
The teacher retiree recognition banquet, April 17th, and the April 29th is the Sioux Falls Education Foundation fundraiser for the Barrel House. So I just wanted to put those, remind them on the calendars.
okay, great.
I think we'll have a couple of policies that are just, review revised, minor changes for Monday, so nothing major.
On the budget committee, I just want to say, this is my first time on there, and it's amazing how much work goes into it and how impressive it is that that's laid out the way it is for us to see. Yeah, Mr. Reed teases that it's complicated, but I can't imagine what you do to make it so that we can read it. So everybody that's involved with that, I appreciate that.
Thank you. Anything else to come before the board at this time? Then we are adjourned. Thank you.